Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the last Tocqueville lecture of our fall season. The Tocqueville lecture series is named after Alexis de Tocqueville. Born of the French aristocracy, Tocqueville examined the world to understand democracy. His investigations convinced him that liberal ideas, which rejected both the antiquity of aristocracy and doubted the promises of the French Revolution, were the progression of history. Whether individuals fought for or worked with these ideals, he was convinced that equality of conditions is a providential fact. This lecture series invites scholars, professionals, and civic leaders to present on the ideas of liberty and equality as they relate to other concepts important in the founding and continuation of American government. Hosted on the campus of Jacksonville State University, these free lectures are open to the public. We welcome the campus, community, and country to listen, think, reflect, and engage with each other. The Tocqueville Lecture Series is funded by generous grants from the Jack Miller Center and Alabama Humanities Alliance. The Jack Miller Center is dedicated to advancing education in America's history, its political and economic institutions, and the central principles, ideas, and issues arising from the American and Western traditions, which continue to animate our national life. The Alabama Humanities Alliance exists to provide context, build empathy, and make the state of Alabama a more vibrant place to live all through the humanities. And we appreciate both of them supporting tonight's lecture. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Richard S. Ruderman to our campus. He's an associate professor and past chair in the Department of Political Science at the University of North Texas. Sadly, JSU is joining Conference USA just as North Texas is leaving, so we won't get a chance to meet on the football field, but at least we get a chance to engage in some academic discussions with each other. He studies the history of political philosophy, specializing in classical Greek thought, including Thucydides, Plato, Xenophon, and Aristotle. He also studies Machiavelli, liberalism in Locke and Montesquieu, and Nietzsche. His work is also in American political thought, especially on the topics of leadership in Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. He's published articles in major journals on Aristotle concerning prudence, Homer on individualism, democratic statesmanship, Locke on education, and most recently on Lincoln's second inaugural and the problem of justice, which is in the recent edition of the American Journal of Political Science from the summer of 2020. He's written on numerous other topics within books, including one of my favorite works, Xenophon's Memorabilia, and The Question of Virtue, which is an entirely important book that we probably should all read more often than we have time for. It's with great pleasure that I invite Dr. Richard S. Ruderman to the stage to present tonight on Frederick Douglass's remarkable eulogy of Abraham Lincoln.
I'm supposed to use this microphone. Can everybody hear me? So the good news is if you can't hear me, just let me know and I can make changes. The bad news is I'm going to shift to charades, and that's how I'm going to explain what I have to say. Just a quick word before we get started that I only do the most up-to-date topics in all of my talks. Just yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, there was a long, very nice op-ed praising Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and it mentioned in passing that it was a very succinct speech, 282 words, I believe. And he went second after a earlier speaker, Edward Everett, spoke for well over 3 hours. So I'm aiming to try to thread that needle and go somewhere in between the two this evening. So my talk is Frederick Douglass's appreciation of Lincoln's statesmanship. So among America's many contemporary problems, an absence of anything resembling statesmanship is, I would suggest, perhaps the gravest one. Second only to that, and I suspect contributing to it, is our lack of appreciation for and understanding of what statesmanship is, why democracies need it, perhaps more than any other political system, and how, especially in a self-governing democracy, it might do its job. I'd like to start by saying a few general words about statesmanship in a democracy, and then move on to my primary topic, an analysis of Frederick Douglass's 1876 eulogy of Abraham Lincoln, in which he gives an account not only of Lincoln's statesmanship, but of Douglass's own capacity to perceive and understand that statesmanship as it evolved from an initial doubt bordering on hostility toward it. Those who think about these things sometimes suggest that our ever-increasing partisanship makes statesmanship much more difficult, if not impossible. While there is some truth to this, it is worth recognizing that our current lack of bipartisanship, serious though it is not yet at the level of the severity faced by Lincoln in the 1850s and 1860s. And while someone like Churchill had to confront some fellow Englishmen who couldn't recognize the evil growing in Nazi Germany, there was no broad, politically ensconced, internal pro-Nazi sector of his country with which he had to deal. And the fact that the evil was a foreign one, external to Britain, served, if anything, to help unite his country around him. And that is to say, the kind of internal domestic discord faced by Lincoln was perhaps a greater challenge to statesmanship than faced by any other democratic statesman. So if not lack of bipartisanship, then what are the current barriers or obstacles to statesmanship? I'd suggest that there is one political and another moral barrier to consider. More precisely, our understanding of what politics is and how it's done is the first reason for our failure to appreciate the need for statesmanship. And our understanding of how to identify and eradicate moral evil is the second. Let's consider them in order. Anyone who's read an American government textbook, anybody here, is sure to be familiar with Harold Lasky's famous definition of politics as who gets what and how. I've always been puzzled by American political scientists' acceptance of this definition from someone who, as a pro-Stalinist, hard-left Marxist, was not a particular friend of liberal democracy. At any rate, it offers a cynical, amoral, and hardly inspiring portrait of politics. And in portraying interest group or class politics with its threats, deal-making, and inevitable cast of losers as the core of politics, Lasky's definition leaves no place for statesmanship. One is left hoping when one reads it, perhaps idly hoping for the withering away of politics, something that could only occur in the universal and classless society brought about in the final communist revolution. In addition to this grim portrait of politics, we're also burdened today with a somewhat narrow view of what I will call moral education. I'm not here referring to the university's efforts to produce engaged and informed citizens. Rather, I'm referring to the increasing abandonment of relying on moral education at all to alter or fix wrong or even evil behavior. Instead, we believe more and more in naming and shaming. We've come to rely ever more on isolating and identifying bad behavior and then denouncing it, not with any hope of changing the perpetrator's behavior, but to bring them to justice. And justice here means either being pronounced guilty by something like the International Criminal Court, if the crime is international in scope, or being banned and canceled if the crime is domestic. But what has all this to do with Lincoln's statesmanship? While the problems I refer to have come to the fore in recent years, it turns out that they are not altogether new. While neither Lasky's definition of politics nor Lasky's own political outlook was in any way pro-slavery, it wasn't, it, which I suggest in embryo in the 19th century, couldn't be used to generate a moral or political denunciation of slavery. As Lincoln was coming up in politics, that is, slavery had not only existed in America for over 200 years, had not only been admitted into the Union in 1789, had not only received a boost from the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, had not only been reaccepted where it already existed in the Missouri Compromise of 1820, but was even expanding, spreading beyond the horizontal line that the compromise drew in the middle of the country, north of that line, thanks to the 1850 compromise, and was even being defended notoriously as a positive good by John C. Calhoun in the 1840s. As Lincoln tried to re-enter politics in the 1850s, moreover, things got even worse on many fronts. In 1854, Pro-slavery forces entered the territory of Kansas, enabling it to enter the Union as a pro-slavery state. In 1857, the Supreme Court issued its notorious Dred Scott decision, asserting that Blacks were not and could never be citizens of the United States. And in the 1858 contest for the Illinois seat of the US Senate, Lincoln debated the powerful incumbent Democratic Senator Stephen Douglas, whose popular sovereignty thesis, namely that self-governing democracies empowered majorities to do what they wished without having to defer to some higher standard of justice. And he lost. He won the debate, the words, but he lost the vote for Senate. Complicating, but in an odd way also enabling Lincoln's ability to carve out a genuinely middle position, that is a moral position that was also politically viable, was the growing presence of the abolitionist movement, turbocharged by the speeches and newspapers produced by William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison, for whom Frederick Douglass conceived what he later wrote was a certain hero worship, took what appeared the truly moral position of fiercely denouncing, what we today call naming and shaming, slaveholders and those who defended or even indulged them. Lincoln's opposition to Garrison-style abolitionism marked, as we shall see as we examine the eulogy, both one, the beginning of Douglass's doubts about Lincoln's meaningful or sincere fidelity to the anti-slavery cause, and two, the beginning of Douglass's education in the deep flaws in Garrison's approach, from which Douglass broke by the 1850s, and eventually his education in the subtle and profound statesmanship of Lincoln. So now we'll turn to the eulogy itself. Even though we've only looked at some of the highlights, or rather lowlights, of the story of American slavery, and then only up to the situation in the 1850s, with no discussion at all of Lincoln's election to the presidency and his conduct during the Civil War, I believe we are prepared to examine Douglass's eulogy of Lincoln and his statesmanship. Douglass begins his eulogy not with any reference to Lincoln, but with appreciation of the, quote, very favorable circumstances under which he and his audience were meeting on April 14th, 1876, the 11th anniversary of the assassination of Lincoln. In particular, he notes the fact that free Black men would not, 20 years earlier, have been permitted to gather for this purpose, not to mention that many of those gathered would not have been free Black men 20 years earlier. And he then praises the Freedmen's Association themselves, who raised the funds and arranged for the building of the monument, for their nobility of their gesture. For their actions, he stresses, were motivated by gratitude and appreciation for, quote, the vast, high, and preeminent services rendered to ourselves, to our race, to our country, and to the whole world by Abraham Lincoln. The fact that their actions were motivated by gratitude and appreciation, they were paying back, not as we do pay forward. And that Douglass's own insistence that his references to the past were not made in malice, for this is no day for malice, he said, proved to be essential features of the eulogy. For they not only echo Lincoln's famous call in his second inaugural for malice toward none and charity toward all, but demonstrate that in heeding that call, Douglass and the Freedmen's Association were living monuments to Lincoln's final act of statesmanship. While the initial reference to Lincoln gave the broad reasons for appreciating and being grateful to Lincoln, the remainder of the eulogy is devoted to Douglass's recounting of the many reasons why appreciating Lincoln, and especially his statesmanship, was so very difficult at the time. Chief among these reasons was that, quote, Abraham Lincoln was not either our man or our model. In his interests, in his associations, in his habits of thought, and in his prejudices, he was a white man. Moreover, far from appearing to aim at doing good for our race, our country, and to the whole world, Lincoln had always been, quote, preeminently the white man's president, entirely devoted to the welfare of white men. And he says he had been this, not seems to have been this. Douglass then does something quite unusual for a eulogy. He speaks ill of the dead. He presents the case in extended detail against the greatness and even the goodness of the man he is eulogizing. And here are 7 actions and non-actions of Lincoln that Douglass will later say tried the patience of American Blacks. He was willing at the start of his administration to deny, postpone, and sacrifice the rights of humanity of Black people and to promote those of white people. 2, his one principle was opposition to the extension of slavery. 3, his motive in doing so was his patriotic devotion to his own race. 4, he was ready to draw the sword of the nation to protect, defend, and perpetuate slavery where it existed. 5, he was ready to execute all the supposed guarantees of the United States Constitution in favor of the slave system. 6, he was ready to pursue, recapture, and send back to the fugitive slave to his master. And 7, he was ready to suppress a slave rising for liberty, though the guilty masters were already in arms against the government. The rebellion had begun. They were not even trying to be part of the Union. The white citizens, he concludes, were the children of Abraham Lincoln. We Black citizens are at best only his stepchildren, children by adoption, children by forces and circumstances and necessity. This last comment, an apparent allusion to Lincoln's stated reason of military necessity for issuing the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, seems to me the one misstep or overstatement that Douglass makes in the eulogy. Lincoln did indeed cloak the proclamation in the very prosaic words of military necessity. Words that Karl Marx, in writing a journal article at the time, reviewing the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in the fall of 1862, says, quote, all the words resemble and are intended to resemble the trite summonses that one lawyer sends to an opposing lawyer. But Marx correctly, it seems to me, chalks this approach up to Lincoln's unique, among world statesmen, refusal to engage in buskin, old 19th century word, which we would call performative moralizing. Lincoln, he writes, always presents the most important act in the most insignificant form possible. Others, when dealing with square feet of land, proclaim it as a struggle for ideas. Lincoln, even when he is dealing with ideas, proclaims the square feet. Marx, that is, recognized in Lincoln's prosaic appeal to military necessity the reassuring absence of moralizing and the possible presence, albeit hidden, of a moral intention. Douglass's recounting of the reasons that Black Americans had for thinking Lincoln was not in their corner and would not be their liberator all turn on his delaying and postponing any direct confrontation with the slaveholding South. And indeed, there may be no greater example of Isaiah Berlin's dictum that politics is the slow boring of hard boards. And Lincoln could have written that in his own journal. Why could he not see the wisdom in our preferred approach of denouncing wrong and demanding immediate change? What accounts for Lincoln's almost superhuman patience, his deadly moderation, as Lord Charnwood, Lincoln's best biographer, terms it? Because this approach is no personal or psychological tick, because instead it goes to the core of Lincoln's democratic statesmanship, we have to dwell on it and recognize that there's really no one key thing that accounts for it. Unlike, for example, Martin Luther King Jr., Lincoln never says anything like, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. King, that is, could counsel patience insofar as he did, because he had the belief, the pious belief, that justice, in the sense of a happy ending, was somehow guaranteed. Lincoln, by contrast, in an early pre-presidential speech, takes issue with the hopeful anti-war position that slavery, being an anachronism, would fade of its own accord over time. Lincoln noted back then that on two opposite banks of the same river, that is, where the terrain and the environment are essentially identical, Slavery was found on one side of the riverbanks and no slavery on the other. He concluded that communal and political support or opposition to slavery is the sole determining factor whether it will continue or not. And he says in a passage from the second inaugural that Douglass quotes in the eulogy, by way of defending the similar sounding claims that all God's ways are just, that God could quite easily, in seeing justice done for the horrible act of American slavery, require that, quote, each drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be paid with one drawn by the sword. Justice, that is, precisely insofar as it does oppose slavery, might well end by destroying the Union for having maintained it. Douglass comes to repeatedly praising Lincoln's patience, especially when assailed from all quarters and for contrary things, and captures, somewhat better than King, Lincoln's attitude toward time itself. Toward the end of the eulogy, Douglass recalls how, though Lincoln seemed tardy to Black Americans, he was somehow steering a middle course between the fatalistic, nothing to be done but wait attitude and King's overly optimistic, justice will prevail attitude. Douglass says, whatever else in this world may be partial, unjust, and uncertain, time is impartial, just, and certain in its actions. In the realm of the mind, my italics, as well as in the realm of matter, it is a great worker and often works wonders. Just as time permits oceans to rearrange shorelines, it also allows arguments and political speeches to alter, sometimes to wondrous degrees, people's views and deeply held prejudices. Lincoln's patience was such a political virtue because he didn't idly wait for time to do its work unaided. He counted on it to provide the arena in which people could be changed. Lincoln was an avid reader of Shakespeare, and we know from a letter he wrote to a well-known Shakespearean actor of the day that his favorite play was Macbeth. He doesn't cite his favorite passages, as he does for Hamlet, also discussed in the same letter. But there is a curious passage in Act 4 of Macbeth, where Malcolm, a far from impressive political actor, bemoans his lacking of any of the appropriate qualities of a genuine king or leader. Quote, I have none of the king becoming graces, as justice, verity, temperance, stableness, bounty, it's, I believe, supposed to be pronounced perseverance. We know it as perseverance. Mercy, lowliness, devotion, patience, courage, and fortitude. Now, not only is patience openly listed as the 10th of the 12 kingly virtues, but by my count, a full 6 of the 12, half, are variations on the theme of steadiness and moral restraint that came to exemplify Lincoln's statesmanship, namely temperance, stableness, perseverance, lowliness, patience, and fortitude. Lincoln seems to have aimed to become the kind of ruler that Macduff, the Scottish nobleman to whom the speaker Malcolm was speaking, approved of. According to Douglass, the problem for Black Americans was that while they sought an end to slavery, Lincoln was focused on saving the Union. And Douglass quotes Jefferson as saying, 1 hour of that slavery was worse than ages of the oppression the founders rose in rebellion to oppose. Could Lincoln justify his prioritizing saving the Union over ending slavery, a worse evil than those from which the Union arose in the first place? Now, saving the Union has a range of meanings and implications. The representative democracy that was the American Republic was an experiment in self-government. Were it to fail, to disintegrate, the last best hope for free government extended thus far only to Lincoln's primary constituency, white Americans, would be snuffed out. And were that to occur, it is far from clear how slavery in the American South would ever have been ended. Douglass himself had broken from Garrison and his version of abolitionism over union, when the latter had declared no union with slaveholders. It's worth recalling why Douglass had recognized that ending slavery without the Union was most unlikely, if not impossible. For the North to leave the Union out of a moral disgust with slavery was, said Douglass, tantamount to leaving the slave to free himself. Such abandonment amounted to preferring the moral comfort of white Northerners, who would apparently be satisfied with denouncing slaveholding, over the emancipation of slaves. One might almost say he was the white man's abolitionist. Should the North give up all political influence over the South by abandoning the Union, leaving it with no weapon other than naming and shaming? It would become more likely that the slaves would never be emancipated. Decades before he penned the eulogy then, Douglass had already learned the core feature of what would become Lincoln's statesmanship. Politics, far from being the sinful business that Garrison thought it to be, was the only avenue by which moral goods or goals could be realized in a self-governing world. While Lincoln was fighting first and foremost to save the mere existence of the Union, with all its flaws, including the gravest, namely slavery, he understood that he understood that act to entail saving and defending the Constitution. That indeed has been his oath of office. That is why he was so deferential to existing law. And the purpose of the Constitution wasn't merely to see the Union continue in existence, but, as it says in the preamble, to forge a more perfect Union. Of course, one had to secure the mere existence of the Union in a world, to repeat, where observers highly suspicious of democracy as a viable form of government thought it would fail, in order to then carry on the post-war work of perfecting it. Now, Douglass mentions that Lincoln actually began that work by issuing the Emancipation Proclamation during rather than after the war. Now, Douglass may seem at first to be among those critics of Lincoln who discerned amid his saying, as Douglass reminds his audience, quote, if he could only save the Union with slavery, he would do so. He claimed he found a certain, as he mildly puts it, indifference to slavery. But Douglass's view of the relation of saving the Union to ending slavery is remarkably subtle and unfolds throughout the eulogy. First, in his bill of particulars against Lincoln, he not only calls him the white man's president, he stresses Lincoln's severely limited aim of opposing the extension of slavery. Lincoln, that is, focused exclusively on saving the Union, indifferent to slavery and its continued existence. But after noting how much this posture, along with additional similar acts, left Black Americans, quote, grieved, stunned, and greatly bewildered, Douglass goes on to explain how, with a slight but crucial shift in perspective, Lincoln's actions could be understood quite differently. If, he says, we were, quote, to take a comprehensive view of Lincoln and to, quote, make reasonable allowances for his position, namely as the white man's president, sworn to uphold the Union and the Constitution, and finally, to consider, quote, the stern logic of great events, we could then penetrate the mist and haze that surrounded him and come to the ultimate conclusion that he was using time granted or imposed on him by the war to move his white followers' views. Perhaps most striking, and surely the most illuminating feature of Douglass's analysis of Lincoln's statesmanship and of his own path to coming to appreciate it, is Douglass's starting point, Lincoln as the white man's president. That is, Lincoln was, or appeared to him to be, a partisan. And we began by denouncing partisanship as the opposite of statesmanship. He doesn't say whether he understood himself to be a partisan of the opposing perspective, the Black man's partisan. I think it's safe to say, however, that is exactly how he understood himself. As the great scholar of both Lincoln and Douglass, Herbert Storing, once wrote, paraphrasing Frederick Douglass's views, this is not a direct quote from Douglass, opposing any plan of colonization, excuse me. He says, I think the US has a duty to keep her Black stepchildren. I think she will be enriched by so doing, and that the problems involved in it can be solved. However, the cost to the country of retaining the freedman and its possible damage to the fabric of American political life are not questions it is my duty to ponder deeply. Sorry. To move from this abstract level to the case at issue, did either Lincoln or Douglass argue that the institution of slavery was bad for white America? Did either Lincoln or Douglass argue that the institution of slavery was bad for the slaveholders themselves, as even Jefferson had done in his notorious chapter on race in his notes on the state of Virginia? The answers to both questions, first for Douglass, is yes. He made both arguments in a lot of his earlier speeches quite openly, barely hinting at his own efforts in the eulogy, which spares him being charged with mere partisanship. I believe that Douglass's efforts at discovering and revealing Lincoln's far less openly expressed but similar answers to the questions is the core purpose of the speech. First, Douglass. In his famous The Meaning of the 4th of July to the Negro speech, 1852, Douglass had vigorously argued that the existence of slavery, quote, in this country brands your republicanism as a sham, your humanity as a base pretense, and your Christianity as a lie. But does failing to abide by the religious, moral, and political standards you espouse do you any harm? Douglass continues, it destroys your moral power abroad. It corrupts your politicians at home. It saps the foundations of religion. It makes your name a hissing and a byword to a mocking earth. It is the antagonistic, we would say divisive, force in your government, the only thing that seriously disturbs and endangers your union. It fetters your progress. It is the enemy of improvement, the deadly foe of education. It fosters pride. It breeds insolence. It promotes vice. It shelters crime. It is a curse to the earth that supports it. And yet you cling to it as if it were the sheet anchor of all your hopes. Douglass makes plain then that slavery corrupts the white slaveholders' character and by putting the Union at risk stands poised to dash their political hopes. Yet Douglass, for all his blistering eloquence, was not president, much less the white man's president. If Lincoln, I suspect, would have agreed with every word of Douglass's that's just quoted, he certainly never said anything like it in any public address. Douglass tried to explain why this was in the eulogy. Lincoln felt both a natural bond with and a political responsibility to white America, his constituency. And while he had risen from extreme poverty to occupy this big White House, he was loath to employ anything smacking of authoritarian or tyrannical techniques toward the very American people he represented. That refusal stemmed from his firm belief in self-governing democracy. That meant, in turn, that the very people whose morals and policies were in need of improvement had somehow to be the agents of that very improvement. Now, this had not really been asked of them by America before Lincoln. The founders famously suspected the people of lacking good judgment. They took away from them as much agency, political agency, as possible. They would have nothing to do with the appointment of Supreme Court judges. They would only indirectly have to do with the election of their presidents and senators. And while they would directly elect their representatives, Congress was to be arranged so that, according to the Federalist Papers, each representative would filter the somewhat haphazard wills of their constituents and then, by engaging in the arts of politics with their fellows, cobble together an aggregate good, something not quite common good. By the time Lincoln engaged in his famous debates with Stephen Douglas in 1858, a new concept was being devised to grant the people their sovereign authority over politics in this country, popular sovereignty, as espoused by Stephen Douglas. Treating the Constitution largely as a brake only on the federal government, Stephen Douglas felt that the states, or rather the majority of the people within each state, had more or less unlimited right to do as it pleased. Nor was it the right of politicians to lecture or hector them. Thus, although he actually opposed slavery himself, Stephen Douglas said he does not care whether slavery be voted up or down. He thereby replaced the founder's suspicions of the people with flattery of the people. Could Lincoln, as a partisan of those people among whom he had grown up, accept such a view as representing genuine democracy? The answer, of course, repeated over and over in the 1858 debates, was no. But he said so only after conceding one major component of Stephen Douglas's democratic theory. In fact, he stressed 1 year later, after the debates, there is a genuine popular sovereignty. That's a tongue twister. But it is not the popular sovereignty that Stephen Douglas invented, as he said in one of the debates. In a democracy, the people really do ultimately rule. However many fences the founders' Constitution may have placed between them and ultimate decision-making, that is, in a democracy, the will of the people will ultimately prevail. By the way, for political scientists among you, the famous political scientist Robert Dahl, who rose to fame and influence with the publication of Who Rules, claiming hidden elites really ruled in America, did recant that view late in life in something I read in the early 1990s, conceding that ultimately the will of the people does prevail in America. Lincoln, for his part, stated, in America, the will of the people is everything. Without it, nothing can succeed. With it, nothing can fail. So far, sounds much like Stephen Douglas. But Lincoln then adds, consequently, he who molds public sentiment goes deeper than he who makes laws, for he makes laws possible or impossible to be enacted. Rather than blindly defer to the will of the people, as populist politicians might do, Lincoln advises politicians to rise to the level of statesmen who will dare to mold public opinion. In the debates, Lincoln was careful to contrast Stephen Douglas's do not care policy with the Republican Party's position that slavery is wrong. It is a moral, a social, and a political wrong. Public opinion, that is, must be consulted, as Frederick Douglass put it in the eulogy, but it should not simply be deferred to. The public, Lincoln thought, could be educated. And not, as everyone from Thomas Hobbes to early progressives in America like Herbert Crowley thought, by institutions of higher learning, but by elected officials whom they knew well enough to have gained their trust and support. All this makes Lincoln a somewhat unusual partisan of the white citizens he represents. And it is Frederick Douglass's recognition of the use to which Lincoln put his sharing of the prejudices of white people that enabled him to understand Lincoln as a genuine statesman. As Frederick Douglass makes clear, Lincoln didn't share the worst of those prejudices at all. He openly opposed them. Instead, he understood and empathized with those prejudices so that Lincoln was in the most unusual position of knowing which prejudices could be or must be left alone and even appealed to, and which could thereby be reformed or removed. Consider another line of argument that Lincoln uses in his debates with Stephen Douglas. In pushing against slavery, Lincoln had to promote the idea of equality. This is why he called the Declaration of Independence, which highlights equality, an apple of gold in a constitutional setting of silver. Constitution, until the 14th Amendment, didn't mention equality. Knowing his audience, Lincoln did not attempt to argue that whites and blacks, at least in 1858, were altogether alike. He says, quote, I have never seen, to my knowledge, a man, woman, or child who was in favor of producing a perfect equality, social and political, between Negroes and white men. It's worth noting that not having seen any such person is more a characterization of his audience and leaves open the possibility that Lincoln himself may have entertained that thought at least not while looking in the mirror, I suppose. As he said, I do not say that a black enslaved woman is my equal in height or complexion, et cetera, et cetera. He gives lots of examples, but in her right to eat the bread earned by the sweat of her own brow, she is my equal, the equal of Judge Douglas, and the equal of any man here. I'd like to conclude by returning to the topic of time and Douglas's agreement with Lincoln on what hopes it is reasonable to invest in it. Among the things Douglas chastised Lincoln for was his readiness to leave slavery alone where it already existed. What he doesn't mention in the eulogy is that Lincoln agreed with the founders who, despite their having compromised with slavery in founding America, felt that where it was on the road to ultimate extinction. Lincoln hoped that political actions taken slowly, sometimes even rewarding slaveholders for manumitting their slaves. By the way, Frederick Douglass accepted money from some supporters to buy his own freedom against the wishes of William Lloyd Garrison, who despised using immoral means, mammon, to achieve moral ends. He hoped by reminding Americans of their ideal of equality to move them over time to realizing it in fact. The war interfered with this hope, as he knew it would, yet another reason he didn't want the war. Just as Lincoln used his shared prejudices to remove some prejudices of his audience, so he used the war as an opportunity for emancipation. Frederick Douglass points to this, the Emancipation Proclamation, as the moment Black Americans could finally believe in Abraham Lincoln. Still, as Frederick Douglass alludes to, there were heated disagreements between the two men, chiefly over whether or not to allow Blacks to enlist in the Union Army. This was after emancipation itself and colonization, the most important issue the two men quarreled over. And it may be the one occasion on which Douglass's partisan concern for the future enjoyment of emancipation and freedom for Blacks met and overturned Lincoln's overriding concern to save the Union by winning the war. Lincoln's concern was not that Blacks could not or would not fight. It was the fear, knowing the prejudices of whites as he did, that the troop cohesion and morale would suffer, putting victory at risk. Lincoln's eventual acceptance of Douglas's position was probably the greatest risk Lincoln took in his statesmanship. And this too earned gratitude from Douglass. Frederick Douglass closes with a brief account of Lincoln's assassination. Serving as it did no purpose, the war was all but over. The assassination was a pure act of malice. Even it, in Douglass's analysis, served some good purpose, however, filling the country with, quote, the deeper abhorrence of slavery and a deeper love of the great liberator. Finally, Douglass turns from praise of Lincoln to praise of his audience, the freedmen who erected the statue. In doing all that could now be done to pay back Lincoln for what he had done for them, in showing appreciation or benefits or benefactors, the audience showed their true humanity. This remarkable finale amounts to a warning to future agitators against the remaining injustices they faced, and there were many in the Jim Crow period, not to fail to acknowledge their benefactors, flawed though they may be. Refusing gratitude to Lincoln in his statesmanship, as various later revisionist views of him did, would reflect worse on the critics than on Lincoln himself, especially after having learned of that depth and scope of his statesmanship from this remarkable eulogy. Thank you. Any questions? Happy to hear from you. Would you rather hear the 3-hour version? I can do it.
Well, while the in-house crowd maybe thinks, I can give you a couple from the online audience if you want, the virtual audience.
Okay.
Michael asked, what does Lincoln's evaluation on the issue of slavery tell us about the great statesman's ability to evolve on questions of great importance?
Lincoln's view of slavery as an evil didn't evolve at all. It was something that he had known from the start. He said in a letter that is quoted, not by Douglass in the speech, but by Philip Foner, who is the editor of the collection of writings by Douglass. He right there puts the reference to this remark that Lincoln makes, which he cannot remember a time he didn't oppose slavery. Absolutely. So in some sense, that no evolution really took place. Clearly, an evolution did take place in his understanding of what to do with freed Black people. Lincoln, as Douglass quite correctly points out, had definitely played footsie with the idea of colonization, meaning sending Blacks back to a country that was not theirs. They all argued this is our country, to Liberia, Libya. I mean, there were some possibilities brooded about, and he gave some thought to that, and I believe Douglass was pretty instrumental in changing his mind on that. It is quite remarkable how modest Frederick Douglass is in the eulogy, in sort of really not pointing to himself at all as having been, I think, the one person outside of Lincoln's own orbit who really did make an imprint on Lincoln and did actually change his mind, especially, as I said during the speech, on allowing Blacks to enlist in the Army. So that was, a kind of evolution which was indeed possible.
His second question off of that then is, why do we now, as a public, seem to view such shifts in statesmen with skepticism?
That's a great question. It may be very loosely related to our lack of faith in higher education, broadly speaking, namely that, people come to college to find out who they are, that they aren't already clearly imprinted in what their beliefs and preferences are. And we're here to just sort of give you what you want. Whereas, if the view is human beings can generally evolve over time, we don't have to outsource that to our statesmen. Maybe we could do it too. Then you have a real chance, I think, to have sort of more possibility for evolution. We also are somewhat, I think, stuck at the level of accusing anybody who is changing their mind of flip-flopping. So, you can't win if you change, and you can't win if you don't change. So, I mean, there is that problem too.
I don't need a mic, I'm okay. Thank you. I may not be reading your presentation correctly, but I think I see a fairly tattered and morally soiled Lincoln who is redeemed by his evolution to a strategic statesmanship. Am I misunderstanding you?
I think at least where I use the phrase morally soiled and the kinds you just touched on, those were strictly in reference to William Lloyd Garrison, not Lincoln and not Frederick Douglass. I think those two men show just how much greater they are than Garrison, in that he indulged in the somewhat almost childish desire to just keep his hands clean from all morally questionable acts, to just make it known. If there had been bumper stickers back then, he would have invented the first one saying, I'm an abolitionist on the back of his car, good for you. But I don't think either Lincoln or Douglass took that approach at all.
But if I may follow up, trying to look at the aggregate message here, is there much to redeem Lincoln, in your view, apart from his willingness to evolve to this strategic statesmanship? I mean, morally tattered and apparently flawed, at least in the view of Douglass?
Well, I think it's by overcoming the flaws that he doesn't end up being defined by them.
How does strategic statesmanship overcome the flaws? That's what I'm missing. Isn't that tactical?
I think that the willingness to have blacks serve in the army was almost the opposite of tactical from Lincoln's position. So I think that certainly shows a sign of readiness to put this very important need, as Douglass explained to him, of Black Americans to have helped fight their way to freedom as the one greatest security of them handling freedom properly. And Lincoln sort of agreed and was willing to put that ahead.
But I didn't perceive that as the message of your presentation. Maybe that is cloaked within the presentation, but I took notes. I couldn't find that message. I felt that the emphasis reduced President Lincoln's presidency dramatically. And I mean, I teach the presidency. I have a library of books on Lincoln. I just can't think of any of my books that diminish that president as thoroughly as you have this evening. And I'm frankly mystified.
Well, I'm probably guilty of not having closed an important quote that I did start with. In the middle of the eulogy, I think Douglass states his case most clearly. And had I quoted it all to the way to the end, I think this misunderstanding wouldn't have appeared. Quote, viewed from the genuine abolition ground, Mr. Lincoln seemed tardy, cold, dull, and indifferent. But measuring him by the sentiment of his country, a sentiment he was bound as a statesman to consult, he was swift, zealous, radical, and determined. And I think it was Douglass's ability to see that not even as a shift, but as a shift in Douglass's own perspective, was to appreciate the greatness of Lincoln's statesmanship. So I certainly plead guilty to having failed to quote that, which I should have. But I think that was the intention of my words, to support that conclusion.
Thank you so much for a great presentation. You kind of talked about some of the qualities that you felt came up in Lincoln's statesmanship that make for a good statesman. Could you kind of give a redux personal version of some of those qualities and maybe apply them to certain more contemporaneous American statesmen and statesmen?
How would I sum it up? I mean, a certain idealization of one's audience is always helpful, to sort of recognize that they have some very serious and very wrong prejudices, but that they could be convinced otherwise. I think a very great respect for the whole notion, then in its infancy, and therefore a hopeful notion of self-government is, I think, particularly important for Lincoln. And it's why, even though he was accused of being a tyrant by enemies, which in passing Douglass alludes to, I think any fair or clear reading of the famous early Young Men's Lyceum address from 1838, where he speaks of the tribe of the lion and the family of the eagle, these towering geniuses who would like to be tyrant. I believe there are those who read it as though he was putting himself in that place. I don't see that at all. I see it entirely as warning us not to fall into the trap of begging such a person to come to our rescue. So I think, that's a particularly important and probably timely, conclusion to draw.
We do have a question here about how did Douglass feel when Lincoln was elected? Do we have any information on Douglass's thoughts or feelings when Lincoln won election in 1860.
Should have reread some of that before, and I didn't. I'm not absolutely sure. I believe by then he was quite pleased. He certainly had come fully around. He was in England at the time, Scotland actually, and gave a very famous speech. In this would be 1860 in early fall. That the American Constitution, is it pro or anti-slavery? And it's a remarkable speech that shows how when he was young, he thought with Garrison and, for example, with the 1619 Project today, that it was a pro-slavery document. And then he goes through an account of how, he educated himself on the meaning of constitutionalism and why certain words and turns of phrases, or the absence of certain words and turns of phrases, indicated quite clearly it was an anti-slavery document. He uses a beautiful image at one point saying some of the words in it that he could describe later in the eulogy as giving support to slavery. He said, we're like the scaffolding that one puts on a building as one builds it, meant, of course, to be removed when you're done. As he liked to point out, there is no word in the Constitution that would need to be changed on the day that Blacks are finally treated as equals and removed from slavery. And that was like, for example, there isn't the word slave and slavery and slaveholder don't appear in the Constitution. So I think that was a particularly important point for him.
And sort of to go full circle then of that, Trenton asks, as Douglass grew older, did his overall opinion of Lincoln change in any way?
I've not really been able to find anything on that. I do know his overall opinion of America hardened, and he was, he says some, I wish we had recordings of the way Douglass presented his words, because at the very beginning, he says, among other things, how happy he is that representatives from the executive branch and the Supreme Court, to whom we defer to their always just decisions. I think it's possible he may have been dripping with sarcasm when he said it. We have no record, I don't know. But of course, the 1857 Supreme Court case of Dred Scott was no doubt still on his mind. In 1876, just a little bit later than this eulogy, would see the end of the, Reconstruction, excuse me, thank you. End of Reconstruction, which, certainly was a very big problem. 1883 was the notorious civil rights cases by again, the aforementioned Supreme Court, which more or complicated, but more or less sort of forbade the policing of prejudice in society. And he very much, very forcefully responded against that. But if you do compare his language between that and his denunciation of Dred Scott in 1857, there's both a world of difference in tone. It is more respectful in the later one. But in the earlier one, he only once in the opening line ever referred to his audience as fellow citizens. He was furious with the fact that Dred Scott case told him he wasn't a citizen and couldn't be a citizen. Fast forward to 1883, he referred repeatedly to his fellow citizens throughout the talk and discussing what was wrong, of course, with the case, but something that, in a way, I don't believe he refers to Lincoln at all, but, they now can also be grateful to Lincoln for their ability now to participate in correcting that flaw. He was somewhat famous very late in his life for being approached by a young man who's asking, a young Black man who's asking, what should we do kind of going forward? What's your parting words of advice? And he just apparently said, agitate, agitate, agitate. So it's not, like he was figuring, either in 1863 or 1865 or 1876, that, you know, everything was just fine. There's nothing of the sort, you know, from Frederick Douglass. So.
Kaylee asks, do you think that public education continues some common misconceptions about Lincoln's view on slavery? Or do you think Lincoln is being accurately portrayed in public education?
I think it depends. I mean, I haven't, you know, done any recent research on the textbook, so my only honest answer is I don't know. But my sense is that some of the anti-Lincoln revisionism of like 80 years ago has moved and been removed, and rather more positive view was generally in place. The extent to which the 1619 project does penetrate the schools will, you know, no doubt lower his esteem if that happens.
I'd like to ask a question that you've already, I think, touched on in a couple of your answers. But could you tell us specifically from your research, did Douglass ever, I imagine he received a lot of feedback or flack about from both sides about that speech. Did he ever specifically walk back anything that he said that he wrote in that speech?
That's a wonderful question, and I don't know. I'd like to look that up because that would be very, very interesting. Abraham Lincoln, when he lived, was lucky enough to have Frederick Douglass review his second inaugural. After it was over, and it was mixed with met with some perplexity when it was given. As you know, there's a very harsh third paragraph to the second inaugural. But there was a kind of get together in the White House afterwards, and Douglass was invited by Lincoln, came in. When Lincoln saw Douglass on the other side of the room, he immediately motioned over and said, "Yeah, I don't want to talk to any of these people." And he asked, you know, "Your opinion matters the most to me. What did you think?" And apparently Douglass said it was a sacred effort. So he got a review, and I don't think Lincoln intended to walk anything back of that speech. As to Douglass, I'm really not sure. I think it was generally well received, although, you know, part of it would depend on whether some of the lines, all of which I read straight, were said with some sarcasm or harshness, which we have no record of. So.
Kira asked a question here. Did Douglass's eulogy, or does it today, really have any influence on modern politics? So does Douglass's eulogy have any influence today, perhaps on modern politics, or I would phrase it anyway, could it have any influence on modern politics?
Well, does it? Unfortunately, you know, not too much. It's unfortunately not as widely read as it certainly ought to be. Should it? I think so. It would be nice if Frederick Douglass in general, not just this speech, but his whole career, were more prominent in the 1619 project. It is somewhat striking how little ink he gets in the entire project. And I think that will be a very unfortunate move in the realm of public education if it happens.
We have another question here of, do you think that Lincoln cared too much about keeping the country together? And is this why it took so long to come to conclusions for the Emancipation Proclamation?
I will separate those questions. I think they really are two. I'll do the second one first. He was slow to offer the Emancipation Proclamation, and of course famously overturned an earlier Emancipation Proclamation that had made by General Fremont, because there was no point in issuing a such a momentous document on either flawed legal reasoning, improper scope of its impact, or too soon so that it would just be, so to speak, laughed at, which would in a way be the worst of all possible results. And so he was patient, and also he needed, this is, I'm afraid, just a hard and fast rule of politics. He needed to be speaking from somewhat a position of strength instead of weakness. People who do things out of what might seem desperation are never as convincing as those who seem to be in control of the situation. And it didn't go well for the Union in the early years of the war. They lost much more than they won. And it wasn't until after there had been a few sort of strong successes that enabled him to issue the Emancipation Proclamation at all.
I'll ask a question. Where do you think the main sources of Lincoln's moral education came from?
It's tough. I mean, he was almost entirely self-educated. He did not go to college, and even though very small numbers of Americans did go to college back in those days, most of the founders had gone to college. Not all, but most. He didn't. He was a very avid reader of a fairly small circle of books, but he had very good taste in what books to read. A scholar named Robert Bray has written both a very good article, which he developed in a slightly longer book, on what evidence we have about what Lincoln read. And he just ranks them, absolute certainty to, absolutely certainly not, and, various ones in the middle. So we know some of the things that he did read. Shakespeare was probably at the top of the list. Euclid was what he credited with having taught him how to construct an argument that can't be taken apart and that he never would lose. I mean, he said that's how he became a good lawyer, was to read. I don't think the law schools today teach Euclid, as far as I know. But that. He was a very big fan of a book by Charles Rollin, which has the longest title I think any book has ever had. It's something to the effect, I'm not even going to try, but it's something like the history of the ancient world in the Greek, Roman, Persian, Scythian, and many, many others perspectives, with illustrations from Polybius to Thucydides. The title, just goes on and on and on, and it tries to cover the ancient world. He was known to have read that quite a bit. And at least in the section on Greece, which of course he had a special interest in because the oldest known democracy was in ancient Greece. So that, oh, by the way, the guy who I mentioned who spoke before Lincoln at the Gettysburg Address, he quoted Thucydides a lot in that class, in that part. But so, I mean, the classics were still a kind of, common currency back at the time. But he got it slightly indirectly, but the passage on the Greeks was really almost entirely lifted from Thucydides. And that meant, I hope one day you all get a chance to read Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. It's my favorite book, and I think the most important book that a politician, a citizen, or a person who sees political science, or a decent human being should read. But in any case, it was in that book, he knew all about, Pericles. He knew about Hermocrates, who was a great quasi-democratic leader of Syracuse. All kinds of very important events, including the dangers of demagoguery, which makes a very prominent appearance in Thucydides' book, a fellow named Cleon. So, he already knew from having read these books a lot of the things that, today we might call the guardrails of democracy, a lot of the sort of cast of characters you might expect, both good and bad, to sort of show up in a democracy. And I think a lot of that had to do with that education, plus, again, Shakespeare, who's by far his greatest love. And, he really, especially Macbeth, about political ambition. He was not, somebody, I think, once tried to give him a copy of Kant on moral philosophy. And that was pretty, much cutting edge moral thought at the time. And apparently he did not like it at all. He felt it was too, metaphysical and abstract. And there is, for a president whose, best foot forward is always to do the most prudent thing, Kant distinguishes morality from prudence, right? Prudence is just acting in your self-interest and trying to work out the best, end of the game plan. So he didn't think so highly of prudence, Kant. Whereas morality, is holding yourself to a very high universal moral standard, famous, the categorical imperative, which can never be broken. And Lincoln again thought that that's not a serious way to think about morality. Morality, has to make excuses for, some individual cases. It's no point just, keeping your hands and say, I told you what I think already. I'm not going to, take care about what the situation involved. That's a little bit of some of his reading tastes.
I'll ask again, or another question, since it doesn't seem to be anybody waiting to ask one.
Thank you.
Extract yourself out of body for a minute and put yourself in this audience. Based on your presentation, which is a very interesting topic that most people are not aware of.
Mhm.
What one question do you think is the most important question that should be asked by this audience about your presentation? You obviously have some, we're either fearing or we're hoping that somebody would ask a question.
Well, you mean other than where do you get your ties? No, it's a very good. I think the best question to ask is, what else should I read by Frederick Douglass? And my answer to that question would be one of his 3 autobiographies. His first, which obviously came first, and therefore was shortest, made a huge splash and made him a commanding presence on the abolitionism, talking circuit. One day, however, he told his handlers that, in addition to just telling his story, reciting the facts of how bad slavery is, he would like to, explain and denounce them as well. And they patted him on the head and said, no, you just do your thing. And he was very furious, of course, about that. He continued his education, at that point. And so midlife, he wrote a longer version, which, really does encompass most of what the first one already had and leads through all the important years of the 30s, 40s, and 50s into the beginning of the Civil War. And that one in particular, called The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, I strongly, strongly, strongly recommend. It contains many, many observations about how to have a healthy democracy, not only on the question of slavery and race, also on wealth inequality, something couldn't be more timely. He moved to Rochester, New York, fairly early after escaping from slavery. And it was at the time one of the most sort of middle-class cities in America. And he praised it. He said he felt very comfortable there, and he felt none of the hot breath of hatred that he felt in various places, both not only in the South but in the border states as well. So none of that in Rochester, which he characterized as a place where there are very few very wealthy people and very few very poor people. It really is all something about wealth inequality being bad for public morals, which became something of a theme, for him later on. I think, he's very persuasive about, it's a very powerful passage. And there's, many others, his recounting of the battle he had with a man named Covey, who was employed as a slave breaker. This was a job back then, who was brought in by the master of the plantation because Douglass had tried to escape one too many times. So this guy who, had very hard elbows and, a blackjack the size of your fist was able to, was brought in to take Douglass out to the woodshed and beat him up until he stopped trying to escape. And Douglass didn't lie down and take it. They were in a sort of gigantic battle. He writes about it very powerfully. And in fact, almost, I mean, there's just a couple of like nice touches in his retelling that make it sound quite like Joseph's battling with the angel in the book of Genesis. So it's really, very powerful imagery and story. So I think, learning more about Frederick Douglass, if you like this, I think would be a very good thing to do.
Well, if we don't have any other questions, I want to thank Dr. Ruderman for being here again. I want to thank him for helping to educate us here on Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln and statesmanship as it relates to liberty and equality in American political thought. I'd like to thank the Jack Miller Center and Alabama Humanities Alliance again for funding this. And I hope you will join us again in the spring when we bring you another trio of lecturers on these topics. Hope everyone has a great night. Bye.